offices in Arkansas. There's 75 counties in Arkansas. This county where we're sitting is the very best website for history of their sheriff's department. I think they have an image of every sheriff that served here except for two.
Except for two.
Anybody can find those two pictures, you'll probably get a steak dinner.
Yeah.
Jeff will buy it. And also, we can certainly offer our thanks and appreciation to Mary Ann for her two great books documenting the homicides that occurred throughout the history of Baxter County. That had to be a daunting task to go through there and do all that. So thank you very much. And I know Jeff and others had a big hand in the website. Keep up the good work, guys. It's very impressive. Let me ask you, are there any active law enforcement officers in the room tonight? Would you please stand up? Yes, park rangers are law enforcement officers, statewide authority. Those guys are all park rangers. Josh Jeffers, superintendent at Pinnacle Mountain State Park. Stuart Taylor from Perrin Mountain Home. He's one of our star pistol shooters. Didn't know y'all raised good pistol shooters, but Stuart is one. And Tracy King, bless him, he ran Bull Shoals, White River State Park for many years, did a fantastic job. And to punish him, they gave him my old job when I retired. I feel so sorry. Thank you all for your service. Thank you very much. And I know we might have a retired officer or two. Any retired officers? Please, Marion, stand up. I see one hiding back there that's not standing up. Let me take a minute to embarrass a friend of mine, folks. There's a lot of law enforcement officers in this great state that have done great things. They've saved lives, they've stopped crime, they've done all kinds of things. But this man probably, to me anyway, exemplifies a great law enforcement officer. This is an old Ozark boy from over in Madison County. He decided he wanted to be a state trooper instead of a school teacher. And he went to the state police, worked his way up into the criminal investigation division. He was one of the best criminal investigators the state police had. You remember the blue light rapist case over in Eastern Arkansas? There's the man back there that gets the credit for saving, or serving the public and saving us from that guy. He also retired at the request of Governor Huckabee and ran the crime lab for a while. Remember when it was a mess, they couldn't find the door, much less the evidence they had stored. This is the man that pulled it out of the fire and saved us all by redoing the crime lab. So he decided it's time to go on to another career, the United States Marshal for the Eastern District of Arkansas. Did that till politics changed the office, and then the governor asked him to be the colonel of the Arkansas State Police. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. J.R. Howard. Thank you all for what you do.
I want to say those 3 times was 66 cents to get you senior coffee at Perrin.
I long for the days when we got free coffee, don't you? That's how. Okay. All right, we're going to talk about crime. And does anybody watch television? Does anybody watch the news in this room? Is crime present on your television, or is it just my television? Folks, we're in trouble. We really are as a country. We're in trouble. We need a lot of prayers, like Kim and Marcus and people that are pastors that can lead us in prayer to straighten out some of the mess we're in right now. I don't care what political affiliation you are, but you bleed just the same if you're a Democrat or a Republican. And you hate to lose your property if you're a Democrat or a Republican. And you hate for your grandkids to get hurt or taken away from you, sold into who knows what. So we've got to get this crime wave that we're in under control. I'm not a sociologist. I'm an amateur historian, so I can't speak to this with great authority, but the little bit of studying I've done through the history, and my focus has been mostly 1800s up to now. We've been in other bad crime waves. Everybody thinks the Old West was a crime wave. Marcus says there was somebody killed in Dodge City every day that he watched Gunsmoke. Matt Dillon got it every week. I mean, it was every weekly thing. Hollywood ruined it for us. They really did. They told us things that weren't true. They did a study recently of 5 cow towns, the top 5 cow towns during the period 1870 to 1885, 15 years of cow towns. Ellsworth, Wichita, Dodge, who else? Caldwell. Abilene. And out of those 15 years, they kept, did a count of the homicides that occurred in those towns. How many homicides do you think occurred in 15 years in those wild and woolly cow towns? Anybody guess?
20.
20. Really coming in there with you didn't watch television in the 50s, did you? Cowboy shows. I thought it would be an astronomical number. I really did, because I've read a lot of the Western books, and there was a lot of homicides, but it obviously wasn't centered strictly in the cow towns. There are only 45 homicides. Little Rock can beat that on good eating. It's not as bad as it is now. The next crime wave that came around that really shocked America was one of those social experiments. We've been in a few of those. Thank you, government. Outlawing alcohol. That didn't go over well. 1920 to 1933, there were 2,516 known law enforcement officers killed during the time of Prohibition. For what? To stop somebody from drinking? I mean, we're in the same boat with drugs. You know, we've got to have the enforcement. We've got to educate, stop. We've got to do something, but it's still costing us lives every day. A real good friend of mine, and Jimmy Hinkles, we went to school with, was a DEA agent and lost his life in Peru in '89. He was down there blowing up cocoa labs. Cost us one of our best friends. The thing that turned the era of the Depression and Prohibition around was a pretty shocking event called the Kansas City Massacre. You might want to read up on it a little bit. We're going to talk about criminals and law enforcement officers. Let me read some names out to you. And if you have not heard of this name, raise your hand. If you've heard of it, just keep your hand down. Jesse James, Henry Starr, Elijah Hagler, William Bonney, Leroy Kelly, John Dillinger, Charles Floyd, Manley Jackson, Clyde Barrow, Alvin Carpus, and dear sweet Ma Parker. Everybody knows the names of criminals. Very few people know the names of heroes. Heroes' names are lost in the pages of history. A lot of things are. There's somewhere over 23,000 names on the National Memorial for law enforcement officers killed in line of duty. The Arkansas State Memorial has somewhere over 350. But there are untold hundreds of people that should be on these memorials that have been lost. And that's a challenge I always make to historical societies, to keep your eyes open, see if you read about an officer killed in line of duty in the 1920s or 1880s, and check his name and see if it's on the National Memorial. If it's not, get in touch with the law enforcement agency that you work for if they're still in existence. If not, find somebody else that will help you, and we'll try to get him remembered. This story is about law enforcement officers losing their lives, so let's start with the bad guys. The Barker family They were from the Ozarks, just like all of us are. George Barker started sparking a little girl named Arizona Donnie Clark. And they got married and lived in southwest Missouri, moved around from different towns. They settled when their children were born in the town of Webb City, a Joplin suburb, a mining town. And they had a hard time there because you know what happened when they lived there? Those cotton-picking police officers kept harassing those little boys, those 4 little boys that were stealing everything that wasn't nailed down and turning over outhouses and any other thing they could get into, as juvenile delinquents often do. Well, Ma didn't like them harassing her boys, so they decided to move, and they moved to Tulsa, Oklahoma. Her stepdad and mom lived over there, so she wanted to live close to them. Believe it or not, her stepdad was a Tulsa County deputy sheriff. There's so many different contradictions in these stories, you just can't keep up with all of them. But they moved over there, and they moved into the north part of Tulsa on Cincinnati Avenue. The boys ran with a rough crowd there. It was called the Central Park Gang, and there was about 25 of them that ran together. And again, same type of meanness, mischief. They were stealing, burglarizing, robbing, stealing cars. And you know, those policemen were harassing those kids again. They just wouldn't leave them alone. No matter where they sat, Ma didn't like the way the police officers were treating her poor little boys. Boys started getting older, crime started getting a little bit more serious. Oldest son, Herman Barker. Herman did a stint in Minnesota and Montana prisons for various crimes. And then he hit the big time. He got stopped by a deputy sheriff in Wyoming, and he killed the deputy sheriff. He was still on the run and made it down to Wichita, Kansas, where he got stopped again by police officers. He engaged in a gun battle and killed a police officer and wounded another one. The redeeming feature of the story was the police officers got a few rounds into Herman. He tried to flee in his car, but he was weak and he wrecked his car. He did us a favor. He decided that he didn't want to go to prison or go to the electric chair, so he shot and killed himself. One son down. The next one was Lloyd Barker. Lloyd was kind of strange for a Barker. He didn't seem to be as mean as the others. He did commit one crime, and he picked the wrong people to rob the U.S. government. That doesn't work well, because everyone can get you, and they did for stealing mail. He was sent to Leavenworth Federal Prison and served a pretty good stretch for that crime. He got out on parole shortly before World War II, and apparently never committed a crime again. He decided maybe I ought to work for a living like everybody else. And he ran a bar and grill in Denver, Colorado. Married a lady that had 2 or 3 kids. They seemed to be getting along. Everything was roses. He volunteered for the service in World War II. Was a cook in the Army. Apparently did a good job there. Got out, came back, got his job back at the bar and grill. One night, not long after the war, he was walking up the sidewalk coming home, and his wife shot him in the head with a shotgun. Don't know why. She went to a mental institute for a long while, but maybe there's things we don't know. What lurks behind closed doors, hard to say. Next son, Arthur. Arthur didn't like that name, thought it was kind of sissy, so he was called Doc Barker. He was like the others, liked to burglarize stores, steal cars, and rob places. But he too got into the big time early on. They were building a new hospital in Tulsa, and it was apparently a pretty big construction job, had a lot of important, expensive equipment. He was over there with some buddies one night, robbing the place, and they shot and killed the night watchman. And the guy was probably a retired officer, had a second job just trying to get by, and got shot and killed for it. Arthur went to prison at McAllister State Prison in Oklahoma. Some of these guys that they ran with in this gang were in and out of prison at the same time. One that he was in prison with was a guy that's kind of interesting, and we'll learn a little bit more about him in a bit. He He went by the name of William Weaver, or Bill Weaver. They also called him Lapland Willie. And he had another alias, Phoenix Donald. Strange. He had ties to Mammoth Spring, Arkansas, over here in Fulton County next door to us. I spent several years trying to find a William Weaver in the records over there in the cemeteries. Couldn't find him. One day I had a brain fizz or something and figured out maybe Phoenix Donald was his real name. Now, nobody would be named Phoenix Donald. I mean, that's too strange. Sure enough, he's buried over there in Riverside Cemetery, Phoenix Donald. He got to be friends with Doc, and when he got out, he became one of the gang. He had already had the good qualifications. He killed a police officer in Oklahoma after they robbed a bank over there, and they're trying to get away, and he shot and killed a police officer. Went to see Ma after he got out of prison, and I think he's the one that talked Ma into leaving that Tulsa where all those mean police officers were harassing those innocent little boys and moving somewhere else. They moved to Thayer, Missouri, right across the line from Mammoth Spring. They call it Lapland because the cities kind of lap over each other over there, but I think that Phoenix Donald was driving force behind that. His father and mother had already deceased. He had two sisters there. Kind of strange deal. One of his sisters was married to the sheriff of Fulton County. Here's the Barker gang moving in Fulton County, or right across the line, and for some reason the sheriff didn't know about that. It's kind of odd, but he was a one-term sheriff, and I imagine you know why. I've tried to find relatives of him, and nobody will admit to it. They found a beautiful house on the road just out east of Thayer. It's the road to Myrtle, if you're familiar with it at all. It was set back up on a ridge quite a ways off the highway. Had a long sloping driveway. You could see a car coming for a good 3/4 of a mile. And the gate had a buzzer on it. When you opened the gate, it started ringing a bell inside the house. Perfect hideout for a bunch of thugs. Well, they're set up in a good place to stay, but now they've got to go to work. No, they're not going to catch chickens, and they're not going to work in the 7-Eleven. They're going to do what they do best. They're going to rob and steal and kill. They were about 170 miles northwest of Thayer, west of Springfield, and they were casing some banks to rob. And the main elements that were together that time kind of stayed together the rest of a couple of years, a couple of months. It was Phoenix Donald, Freddie Barker, the youngest son, and Alvin Carpus. Alvin Carpus was a fellow that had been in prison with Freddie Barker up in Kansas. They got to be friends, so he became one of them. Carpus was born Alvin Karpowitz in Canada. He was moved to the States with his family, but immediately took off on a crime spree. They called him Creepy Carpus because he had a real funny expression on his face. See a picture of him sometime, you kind of see what he's talking about. But those three were scouting for banks to rob. The night marshal. Anybody ever heard that phrase, night marshal? It was pretty common back then, and kind of evolved from the night watch. You know, the night watch was one of our earliest forms of public safety, if you will. It's law enforcement and fire department both, because the chimneys were so ratty that they liable to catch on fire during the night. And the night watch would catch the fire, push the chimney over so it wouldn't burn your house down while you're asleep. But he'd also look for people stealing your silver or anything else. And they evolved into the night marshal. We had a day marshal and a night marshal. The night marshal of this town that they were in, Monette, Missouri, his name was Elijah Hagler. It's one of those names we talked about a while ago. Mr. Hagler was a pharmacist by trade. He was owned a drugstore, was doing fairly well for himself. Had 3 young daughters. 1921, his wife died of an illness. And he was left to raise those kids. And then the Depression took his drugstore and his livelihood. So it just so happened that his best friend was the chief of police of Monette and offered him a job as night marshal. Foot patrol making his rounds, sees as he's walking past Hildreth Chevrolet place there in Monette, he sees a new car being pushed out of the bay by two guys. And he knows this is not right, so he draws his gun and tells them to raise their hands. Well, the two pushing the car did. The one steering the car didn't. He raised a handgun and shot Marshall in the chest. The three fled without the new car. And thanks to a faulty eyewitness description and a terrible prosecution effort, two guys from Arkansas were arrested for shooting Marshall Hagler, tried and convicted and sent to the Missouri Penitentiary. And we'll find out who the real killers were, but we won't find that out till 1971, so you've got to hang on a little bit on that one. The guys knew there was no heat on them for shooting this officer. And by the way, Marshall Hagler died exactly 30 days later on the 21st of October, 1931. Any doctors, medical professionals in the room? This is something I didn't know. I'm outside my realm of criminals. Apparently, when a person is quadriplegic back then, there was no medical safe way to see that they received nutrition and were fed. So basically, he starved to death as a result of a gunshot wound. What a horrible, horrible death. The guys went back home to Mom. She fixed them some cornbread and beans, I'm sure. And they decided they better get some grocery money to buy some more cornbread and beans. So they traveled about 54 miles northeast of there to a little town of Mountain View, Missouri. And this was a favorite tactic of theirs for bank jobs. They broke into the bank of Mountain View at 3 a.m. in the morning. No alarms, no nothing set off. So they settled down in the conference room and make themselves comfortable till the staff got there the next morning. They said Phoenix Donald crawled up on the conference room table and went to sleep. They apparently weren't too worried about law enforcement at that time. The employees got there, they met them at the door with guns. They forced them to open the vault. They removed $14,000, which is a considerable sum in 1931. Live on that for a while, but apparently they were greedy. They didn't lock the people in the vault. They put them in the vault, threatened them not to come out for so many minutes, and they left them there. Got away with an oath. They weren't happy with that one, so they decided to look for something else to rob. They traveled 50 some odd miles southeast of there to the town of Pocahontas, Arkansas, over in Randolph County. Just so happens that's my great uncle was the deputy sheriff in that town at the time this happened. The night marshal there was a fellow by the name of Albert Manley Jackson. His dad had been sheriff of Randolph County for several terms, was currently serving as a state representative. Manley was making his rounds on foot, and he sees a car on the court square in Pocahontas. Pocahontas in 1931 rolled up the sidewalks at dark. May still roll up the sidewalks. A lot of towns do, you know, especially that's populated by old people like me that go to bed early. And if I'm keeping anybody up, you feel free to get up and go to bed. I might have to if I keep sleeping. But anyway, he sees this car sitting there. So, good officer, it picks his interest, so he's going over to take a look at it. In the meantime, he stops and draws out his notebook and a pencil, and he jots down the license number, just in case something happens to him. Right, Tracy? Mm-hmm. And he didn't know that Phoenix Donald had got out of the car and wandered off up the alley looking at the back door of one of the banks. So he's standing there jotting down the license number, and Phoenix Donald sticks a gun in the back of his head and takes him prisoner. They put him in the car with criminals. They head out, and the next morning, hadn't been reported missing yet. The next morning, a couple was headed into Pocahontas on Highway 90. And they see an opportunity for the missus to answer a call of nature, is a polite way to say it. So they stop, she wanders out in the woods, and what she finds? A body. A man shot in the back 5 times with a .45 automatic. It was Manley Jackson. The same thing occurred over at Pocahontas, almost identical to the case in Monette. A local man confessed to the killing. He said, I did it, and my friend Joe was with me, he did it, and the city marshal put us up to it. The city marshal hired him to kill the night marshal. A little strange, but again, we've got a conviction, a prison term, a lot of court cases going on about that. You can find some Supreme Court cases or state Supreme Court cases on that if you look on the web. But again, in later years, 1971 to be exact, we find out who actually killed Manley Jackson. Now, I think you've got a pretty good idea who it probably was. November, December 1931, it's starting to get cold, probably about like it was this winter, snow everywhere. Needing new coats, new sweaters, new scarves, new gloves. So somebody breaks into the McCallion department store on Court Square in West Plains, Missouri. And the owners, when they report the crime the next morning, they say they took only the best, the most expensive item in everything they took. They took selected sizes, several different sizes of men's clothing, and one of women's clothing, and got away in the middle of the night. That was on the 17th of December. On the 19th of December, a blue DeSoto car pulls into a Davidson's garage just off the square in West Plains. Anybody here for Joe Smith's program a couple months ago? Yeah. Do you remember him talking about his grandfather ran the ferry across the North Fork River? Do you remember him talking about a blue DeSoto that he ferried across the river? He's gone into great detail with me. He said this brand new DeSoto came onto the ferry, and the guy didn't act too friendly when he pulled on, and like he normally did, Joe said his grandpa walked up, was going to just pass the time of day with a fellow, visit with him like we do in Ozarks. He said when he walked up there, the guy turned his head real quickly, and he said I could tell that he didn't want to talk to me or didn't want to be seen. But I did glance in the back seat of that car, and there was a Thompson submachine gun laying back there. I said I didn't want to talk to him then. So he went on off the ferry and rode off to the east, and we know where he probably wound up, because he was later identified by Joe's grandfather as Alvin Carpus. When the car pulled into the garage there, they told them they had a couple of flats they needed fixed. There were 3 people in the car, 2 men and a younger fellow, like an early 20s guy. And the garage owner looked in the back seat and saw some new clothes with a tag still there. So he knew it was probably involved with the McCallion department store robbery or burglary. He looked out the front door of his garage, and the post office then sat right across the street from it. And he saw Calvin Leroy Kelly coming out of the post office with his mail. Calvin Leroy Kelly was the sheriff of Powell County. He came from a family of sheriffs, Carter County up in Van Buren, Missouri. His dad and his uncle both had served terms as sheriff up there. For some reason, he moved down to Howell County. Well liked, well loved. He wasn't quite Andy Griffin, but he didn't carry a gun a lot. He kept the gun in his car if he needed it. Well, when the garage owner told him what he suspected, he said, wait just a second, let me go get my gun. It was in a pocket holster, and he put it inside his overcoat pocket. Winter, remember, it's cold, everybody's bundled up. So he strolls into the garage. The 2 guys are outside the car. And I don't know how they made him so quick unless somebody said, good morning, Sheriff, or he had his badge on the outside of his coat. But they immediately pulled guns, these 2 men, and the sheriff saw what they were doing and tried to draw his weapon. It was inside his coat, in a pocket, in a holster. He didn't make it. They fired multiple shots, and he fell dead there on the floor of Davidson's garage. One guy jumped in the car and took off in the car. The other guy took off on foot, went down the alley behind the pawn shop markets, and slipped and fell, and they thought they'd got him, but he got up and made it out of there. Large manhunt ensued. Things pointed toward this hideout in Mammoth Spring. So they went down there to raid the house. Carpus, for some reason, decided he would stick around. I think I found out what the reason was. He was going to stick around and hide in the woods and see what happened when they raided the house. Well, they hit it in force, and they found a lot of stuff inside the house, indicating that the occupants had left in a very big hurry. Letters, photographs, clothing, all kinds of things that were left behind that identified them as Maul Barker, Freddie Barker, Alvin Carpus, and Phoenix Donald. Now, Phoenix Donald had been staying with his sister, which lived just down the road, so he split too because he knew they'd be after him. His brother-in-law wouldn't know Fulton County, probably wouldn't bother him too much. But when Carpus saw what they did, he went into Mammoth Spring on foot, broke into the Ford dealership and stole the car there and left. A lot of accounts about where the Barkers went. The most commonly accepted one is they went to outside Joplin, Missouri. There was a fellow over there by the name of Deppy Farmer, who was he operated a safe house for outlaws. They could hide out, pay for a stay there at his house, be protected from the Barkers. Ran a chicken ranch. So some say they went there, and then after that they headed for another safe city. There were a lot of safe cities in America during the 30s. Hot Springs, Arkansas was one of the biggest and best safe cities in America. The chief of police and the chief of detectives were considered by the FBI as the two crookedest cops in America. Everything was for sale in Hot Springs. Well, it's pretty much that way in St. Paul too. So they went up there and they engaged in a campaign of serious bank robbery. They joined forces with members of several other major gangs, and they went all over the Midwest robbing banks. Killed several officers during this crime spree then. Chicago, Minnesota, just different places. Everywhere they went, it seemed like blood was flowing in the streets. And then they figured out a new way to make money. Anybody remember Charles Lindbergh, the great aviator? Remember his young son was kidnapped out of his home? That shocked America. That's one of those crimes that sticks in American consciousness. Is a little baby. They take a little baby out of his crib and offer him back to the parents for money. You know how distraught they had to be. But the man that was leading the New Jersey State Police investigation, matter of fact, his daddy led Desert Storm, Norman Schwarzkopf. His father had New Jersey State Police at the time. And they successfully identified the criminal that did it, and they arrested him, tried, convicted him, and executed him. The baby was found in a shallow grave. Apparently it had died as a result of a fall out of the second story when the kidnapper carried him down the homemade ladder. Tragic story. But the federal government initiated a new law called the Little Lindbergh Law. It suddenly became a federal crime to kidnap someone. As a matter of consequence, a guy from Imboden, Arkansas, was one of the first people ever convicted of the Little Lindbergh Law. Back in that time, Arkansas prison was operated by trustees. They were prisoners that the administration put trust in. So they were trustees that gave them a gun, or two guns, or whatever they needed. And they were the ones that were guarding the other prisoners from escaping. What a strange concept. But this fella from Imboden, he took to it like a duck to water. He saw a guy escaping, shot him and killed him, got paroled, got out, sent back to prison. Another one did it, shot and killed him. He went back, gets sent back to prison. He kills the third one, and they said, okay, that's enough. The next time he gets out, he kidnaps two guys in eastern Arkansas during the robbery. He goes to federal prison under conviction of the Little Lindbergh Law.
He gets to the federal prison, and what do prisoners not like? They don't like prisoners that have hurt or killed other prisoners. So his life was kind of in danger. They figured out that they couldn't protect him in the Atlanta prison. They moved him to the new prison out in California, in San Francisco Bay, Alcatraz. Got out there, same situation, nobody liked him. He was in danger all the time of losing his life. Anybody see Escape from Alcatraz with Clint Eastwood? Remember the guy chopped his fingers off with a hatchet? That was the guy from Imboden, Arkansas. They changed the names to protect the guilty, but that was him. And he eventually got out of prison, lived his life there in Imboden. I was going to go interview him one day when I was in college. My dad said, "You're not going anywhere near that place." Why not? I couldn't understand, but I mean, that allowed an incredible interview opportunity to get away from it. But it's sad that when a little baby is killed like that, it is. The heat that brought onto the Barkers after these was tremendous. The FBI poured all their resources. At the time, they were called the Bureau of Investigation. It wasn't the FBI yet until 35. They poured all their resources into finding these guys and arresting them. They got Doc in Chicago, and he had some papers on him, maybe a letter or something, that indicated that they might want to look down in the area of Ocala, Florida. Supposedly there was a lake down there where they had rented a house. The house set on the lakefront, and this lake supposedly had one of the biggest gators in Florida, and they were out there trying to catch this old Joe alligator. Anyway, they got the FBI instead. They knocked on the door one morning and said, "It's the FBI, you're surrounded, come out." They could hear conversation inside the house. Nobody came to the door, nobody said anything to them, until they decided to reply with a Thompson submachine gun firing out the window. That initiated a 4.5-hour gun battle. Over 2,500 rounds were expended in the gun battle, and it finally slowed down and almost stopped. And they got the handyman that worked there at that place to go in and see if they were ready to surrender. Not very smart. But he went in and pretty soon he looked out one upstairs window and said, "They're all dead, boss." And he went in, the FBI agents went in. Ma was laying in the floor of the bedroom. She had a Thompson submachine gun in her hands or cradled by her with a 100-round drum. Her son Freddie was laying across the room. He had a Thompson submachine gun in his hands. It had a 50-round drum. He was a real good boy. He gave Mama the big magazine drum, 100 rounds. But they were both dead. Then J. Edgar Hoover had a PR problem, I guess you could call it that. You know, how am I going to explain that I killed a grandma, or that an older lady that just, how am I going to explain that my guys took a machine gun to her? Well, he started, his press act started a campaign to vilify her in any way they could. She was painted as a criminal mastermind. She was the smartest thing since Al Capone. She planned all these robberies and all these crimes. And then several of the people that knew Ma said that she couldn't plan breakfast, much less a bank robbery. They said all she did was go places with her boys, and she liked to sit and listen to the radio, Amos and Andy and hillbilly music. But she was dead. That left Alvin Karpus loose and running around, and he became public enemy number one. He stayed in Hot Springs, Arkansas, out on Lake Catherine, for a good long while. The FBI raided the house out there and tore it up. I understand they shot the way out of that house, but he wasn't in there, so got away. In the meantime, there was one of those Senate subcommittee hearings up in Washington where they questioned everything. And a senator from Tennessee didn't much care for J. Edgar Hoover. And he asked him, "Have you ever arrested anybody yourself?" He said, "Why my agency has arrested thousands." He said, "I didn't say your agency. I said, have you arrested anybody?" And of course, he had to say no. He hadn't. J. Edgar Hoover started his career as a government bureaucrat clerk, and he worked his way up. position he was in. But that damaged his reputation by being taken to task like that. So he put out word to all the field officers, if you spot Carpus, call me. I'll be on the first private plane out of Washington to come to you. They found him in New Orleans. They called Hoover. He flew down there. Carpus and his partner, Hunter, Mr. Hunter, were getting in their car. He was suddenly surrounded by FBI agents sticking guns in his face. He surrendered. And one of them turned around and yelled, "We got him, boss." And Hoover came out from behind the building and said, "You're under arrest." So, made him feel a little better, I guess. Carpus was convicted of kidnapping, sent to Alcatraz. They found Phoenix Donald he was raising chickens. I don't know what it was about chickens and gangsters, but they seemed to like him. He was raising chickens in Florida, so they found him and his girlfriend. They were both arrested and sent to Alcatraz, but he was. Doc was there waiting on him. He was in Alcatraz. And Doc was impatient. In 1939, I believe it was, he and two other guys decided to break out of Alcatraz, and that supposedly wasn't impossible, but it was pretty darn near. And they tried, and Doc refused to surrender when the guards told him to stop, and he lost his life with gunfire from the guards. He was buried in California. Lloyd had been buried in Colorado. Herman was buried in a little windswept cemetery over here in Oklahoma called Welch, Oklahoma. It's called Timber Hill Cemetery. So he was there, Herman was, and they took Ma and Freddie over there, and they put up stones for the other brothers. So that's supposedly the resting place of the Barkers. At least three of them, and four if you count their divorced daddy, he wound up there too. Did y'all know that the Barker gang robbed the bank in Yoga? It was terrible, if you paid money for the movie. It was a movie starring Shelley Winters. An unknown actor that made his debut in film, by the name of Robert De Niro or something like that. I don't think he'd be too popular in these parts for some reason. But anyway, they got away with that robbery. That's pretty much the story of the Barkers. Got a few things that I want to share with you. There's some posters up here that from an exhibit down in Little Rock, badges, bandits, and bars. There's a few of them. If you'd like to have one, you're welcome to it. Don't take the reward poster. That was Mrs. Kelly's reward poster. She was appointed sheriff after her husband was killed, and that was the one she kept in her home. In the display case is Sheriff Kelly's revolver and holster that he was trying to draw the day Freddie Barker and Barker shot. Folks, I don't know if we ever are going to, but we're in a time where if we don't do something soon about the crime wave that's ripping this country apart, we're going to be in trouble. And it's going to take each one of you in this room saying, that's enough. We've got to stop it. And Jeff and JR, Tracy, all the guys will tell you, they may only be 10 or 15 minutes away from your house. But if a criminal's already there, they can't help until they get there. And a lot can happen in 10 or 15 minutes. Our choice of location that most of us live in here is a wonderful place. We have a great sheriff's office. We have a great police department. We have a wonderful citizen base here, but that can change overnight. You know, we're seeing mass exoduses from certain states, and they're coming to areas like this. And this can change too, and it can bring all kinds of problems to Jeff's front door we have to deal with here. But keep in mind that we can't let it go on like it's going right now. 1874. A fellow by the name of Isaac Charles Parker. Anybody ever heard of him? He was appointed to the judgeship of the federal bench for the Western District of Arkansas and the Indian Territory. That comprised 74,000 square miles in total. That's a lot of territory to have to patrol. And that was on a horse. It was pretty bad. It was a lawless place. Indians had their own law enforcement system, their own court system, but they could not touch white people. They were immune from Indian law enforcement. So therefore, that's why we wound up with the Indian Territory attached to the Western District of Arkansas. His first major term of court, he had several capital cases come up before him. Eventually, 6 people were charged with capital crimes and convicted. They were sentenced to death by the jury and Judge Parker. And he decided to hang all 6 of those people on the gallows at one time in September of 1875. And that shocked the nation. I mean, nowadays it takes something pretty catastrophic to shock our nation now, but that shocked the nation. And it was front page news in every English language newspaper across the country, out of the country in some places. And they called him a hanging judge. And he often responded, "I don't hang people, the law does." A Fort Smith newspaper had a little bit of common sense about their write-up. And one of the comments they made sticks with me to this day. I wasn't alive in 1874, but I read it a long time ago. And we all need to remember it. It said, "Without the certainty of punishment, there is no deterrent to crime." Period.
Period.
And we are losing grip on our country. You have to make the choice, law and order or anarchy. Is sitting there waiting on you. God bless you. Thank you. I'll take any questions you might have.
Thank you.